Albert Eisenberg from Broad and Liberty. Mr. Eisenberg, as I've asked all of the others, please summarize the key points of your testimony, and then we will turn to the questions. Welcome to this public hearing.
Good morning, committee members. Can everybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you, Senator. As you noted, my name is Albert Eisenberg, co-founder of the regional media publication and think tank Broad and Liberty. I'm a Philadelphia native, grew up in the area, have followed politics, and I have worked on multiple causes and campaigns, including good government causes like LGBT issues, public education, and redistricting. I was the conservative consultant for the redistricting group, Fair Districts PA, in 2017. Before I left, we left mutually. I understood the group by the end of it to be something of a partisan Trojan horse, despite its claims that it was nonpartisan, and I can discuss that with the committee. I've also recently published and co-authored a report that has been submitted to the committee, Redistricting in Pennsylvania, the past, present, and future. I'm not a lawyer. I am a concerned citizen. I'm a researcher. I'm a commentator. I'd like to go over some of the findings of our report that you have in front of you. Namely, the process of drawing maps is inherently political. Moving the map drawing abilities to experts, academics, or the courts merely moves the political decision-making further from the people without making the process less political. With the rules set out by the state Supreme Court in 2017, 2018, the legislature can draw maps that produce nearly any desired partisan outcome, which we'll discuss. And civics education matters. Political, there's no such thing as nonpartisan maps. There's no such thing as nonpartisan map drawers. With respect to the considerable achievements and time put in from the citizen redistrictors that we've heard from, we do need to take a look at and ask who has the time to be producing maps en masse, what the partisan lean of these maps are, because we do not want to be taken for a ride, and the citizens of Pennsylvania should not be taken for a ride by people who are partisans. And that's not to say that everyone is a partisan who submitted the map, but just that it's clear that a lot of these maps will lean further left than the state does. Secondly, in the report that we've published, we discuss how the Pennsylvania Supreme Court basically yielded to activists in tipping the scales in a partisan nature, a 5-2 Democratic majority on the state Supreme Court in a 4-3 vote, rewrote and redrew the lines. It gave an impossible deadline for the state legislature, which many of you all were in 2017, 2018, and were familiar with this process. And that the requirements of the court, which have been delineated, often contradict each other, which I'll discuss. And as we say in the report, me and my co-author, they will undoubtedly be the subject of the next lawsuit, once again decided by a Democratic majority of the court, likely at the expense of the Republican majority in the legislature. Any new map will be ostensibly up to the state Supreme Court's discretion forever. An unfair map in the elected justices' eyes will presumably be any map that results in congressional representation that does not favor their political party. So once again, we have partisan decisions being made by elected partisans, in this case, further away from the people of Pennsylvania, further away from the legislature. One key portion of the report I'd like to draw the committee's attention to starts on page 10. And it's about the quote unquote science of redistricting, science being in quotation marks. People choose their science. Nothing about science, quote unquote, was ever meant to be still, considered in a vacuum, and not to be questioned. If anybody tells you otherwise, they are not advocating for scientific principles, they're advocating for their own principles. Several of the measures that are often cited by quote unquote fair districts activists directly contradict each other. The testimony of Joe A. Chen, a professor at the University of Michigan and a widely held redistricting expert, was held to be very important by the court's decision. But later on, Chen writes, scholars are correct to be concerned about quantitative metrics making judicial legislation and legislative decisions, even harder to detect because judges and the legislature, and you all on the committee, are not usually trained to know when expert witnesses are trying to sneak legislation past them hidden underneath a heap of numbers, Greek letters, and coding jargon. Scholars have already documented how academics, politicians, and even entire nations have suffered from blindly accepting ideas presented with illusory quantitative authority. The science of redistricting often contradicts itself. It often serves partisan ends that are not being revealed to the legislature or to the people, and you all should be very skeptical of the decision-making according to the quote-unquote science. So that is quite important. The efficiency tests that have been cited by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in their decision often contradict each other, and they wasted votes, for example, is an efficiency test versus not splitting constituencies, as Ms. Holt just noted and suggests, different values cut across different ways. One clear and obvious example that ends up percolating in the media is the call from the US Supreme Court and the Voting Rights Act to create majority-minority districts. But as recently as September of 2021, Black lawmakers and the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington are now calling for an end to packing Black voters in House districts. The title of this article saying Black lawmakers now winning in white communities call to an end to packing Black voters in House districts. So is it better to have majority-minority districts, or is it better to cut, divvy up, and split up Black voters into multiple districts because those voters tend to lean at an 80% plus rate or towards Democrats, and Democrats are now suffering because their voters have inherently clustered together. So the overall question, who is making the suggestions of these maps? Who has the time to do this? Check their partisanship, check the results of the maps and how they would lean. Sometimes people who are active and concerned and making noise are labeled citizen activists, and sometimes they're labeled domestic terrorists. Sometimes they're labeled something in between. So who's doing the labeling? This is all George Orwell 101, and members of the committee would be very, very well suited and well informed to question the partisanship and make sure that they are not being taken for a ride by people who are cloaking partisan decision-making in neutral-sounding criteria. The other interesting part of the report that I'll draw your attention to a little bit later on, pages 15 onwards, is a discussion of exactly how our state Supreme Court tipped the scales towards Democrats while cloaking their decision in nonpartisan sounding language. 3 districts to note is the 6th district, which, while Senator Argyle notes, has shifted rapidly towards the Democrats, as many of the wealthy collar counties in Philadelphia have. At the time of the redrawing, it was no certain thing that Chester County, historically Republican, would lead Democrat. So the court did them a favor and carved out just the portion of Berks County, enough to hit the city of Reading and no more, to ensure that that district leaned D. In the new 1st district, the portion of Montgomery County that was added to Representative Brian Fitzpatrick's Bucks County seat was arbitrarily changed to be a more Democratic leaning portion. There was absolutely no reason to take a slice of Montgomery County that was more Democratic leaning and add it to Representative Fitzpatrick's district, but that just tells you everything about what the courts did and why. And then in the new 10th district, represented by Congressman Scott Perry, who's been a perennial target of congressional or federal Democrats, they brought in York City, but no more of York into the 10th district. The rest of York County was packed into the 11th district as a Republican sink. One reason to be suspicious about the nonpartisan groups, quote unquote, is that they ignore Maryland. So you look just to the south of Pennsylvania. I saw a headline yesterday that Maryland Democrats are considering an 8-0 map, Democrat to Republican. It was one reason why I became suspicious of Fair Districts, Pennsylvania, and ultimately was frustrated and made my concerns heard. They were not heard, and I consider them to be a Democratic activist group masquerading as a nonpartisan group. And meanwhile, Republicans are pursuing a vice grip in Ohio. Democrats are pursuing a vice grip in Illinois. These are ugly maps, and they are partisan maps, and it happens on both sides. One final finding of our report is that extreme gerrymandering can be self-defeating, including in the 2000s and 2010s, maps drawn by Republicans in the Pennsylvania legislature by the end of the decade ended up sinking congressional Republicans, often all in 1 or 2 cycles in 2016 and 2018 in Pennsylvania. And even without redrawing the districts, as the court did in 2018, 3 of those Republican incumbent districts would have flipped in their old drawings as well. So we find that partisan gerrymanders have been effective for the party in power about 60% of the time. Democrats and Republicans on this committee it would behoove them to pay attention to that finding. And one last conclusion before I'll take your questions, and I thank you for listening to my testimony. For all the talk about convoluted districts and splitting up communities of interest, activists on the left have changed their tune on the issue entirely. As Republicans work to codify that principle into law, Democrats now favor splitting communities if the result is more Democratic members of Congress. The state Supreme Court has held that districts should be compact and contiguous, and should not divide municipalities and wards unless absolutely necessary. But now John Nagel of the left-leaning Fair Districts PA states that as long as non-splitting is a tier 1 criterion, one cannot draw a fair map in Pennsylvania. Such groups are moving the goalposts as it is now preferred to split and scatter dense left-leaning constituencies in order to spread these highly concentrated Democratic voters to multiple congressional districts. One suspects that when it comes to district drawing, there are and have only ever been neutral-sounding principles. There have never been any neutral principles, only partisan brinksmanship and angling for political advantage. Thank you very much for listening to my testimony.
Thank you. This is very intriguing. Mr. Eisenberg, I've spent a lot of time on this. I don't know that I have ever before looked at the congressional map for Maryland that you've provided to us. And there's no doubt in my mind that that is perhaps one of the most egregious gerrymanders I've ever seen. And it's intriguing to me that while our map was thrown out, as you've indicated, this one was not challenged by some of the groups that you would have thought would have taken that through the court challenge. I'm curious, in your written testimony, you've suggested the possibility of a constitutional amendment to make it clear that this is a legislative responsibility with public hearings and transparency rather than a judicial responsibility. Has that ever been attempted in this state or in other states? Do you know?
Well, what what members of your committee and the state legislature can advocate, you can't tell the courts not to strike down your maps. What you can do is create a process when if the courts do strike down your maps, which is almost a foregone conclusion. And that's what we're suggesting in the report, is to create a new process, either via legislature or via constitutional amendment, to create a process if the courts do strike down the maps. To my knowledge, there's not been such clarification measures. Obviously, we have had some success with constitutional amendments in the last few cycles, including curbing Governor Wolf's emergency powers. So that would be a suggestion that could bring the power right back to the people.
But you haven't seen this successfully amended in other state constitutions across the country?
No, Senator.
Okay. I'm sure my staff will be hunting down that point. It's an intriguing question. Senator Street.
I will say that some of your acknowledgement that this is an inherently, that we are all elected through an inherently partisan process is refreshing. That being said, we now, unlike Maryland or Pennsylvania, the last time the maps were drawn, have an inherently bipartisan, while partisan process laid before us, as we have Republican majorities in House and Senate and a Democratic governor, and no way to get to a map that doesn't either include a supermajority of the legislature, which would have to be bipartisan, or a governor's signature on a map, which would have had to have Republican votes in order to pass. So what is your advice to partisans now drawing a map in a bipartisan way, because we have to do a bipartisan map, because we don't have, unlike Maryland or Texas, we don't have a partisan option.
Thank you for the respectful question, Senator Street. We find ourselves in an incredibly difficult position, as do members of the minority in the legislature, because the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court has all but guaranteed that it's going to intervene if the maps are not to their favor. And we've set the precedent, unfortunately, that activists can create neutral sounding criteria and redraw the maps that have been established by the state legislature. My strongest recommendation would be to consider the specific criteria that have been established and put out by the state Supreme Court, as well, obviously, as the Voting Rights Act, the U.S. Constitution, and the state Constitution, as far as equal size district, not splitting communities of interest, et cetera. And on the Democratic side, you guys are going to have to lobby internally to try and get your maps, not have a governor's veto, because what the governor has no incentive whatsoever to, work with the legislature at this point, when you can just punt it to an activist court. It's part of one of the systemic problems we're facing in American society. It's not just a Democratic or Republican problem.
So look, I mean, I hear you. I think it's a little pessimistic, because there is one incentive. The governor only gets to punt it if Democrats all agree. Despite what folks on the outside, I'm sure that there are great debates in the Republican caucus, as there are in the Democratic caucus. While we are divided into caucuses, those caucuses tend to not be as monolithic as the public would think. And so there is an incentive, because he, at a minimum, would have to hold together enough Democrats so that there isn't a supermajority, because that would, of course, create some problems. And so, look, I will say this. I do respect the fact that you've acknowledged that there is no nonpartisan way of doing this, but would point out to the public that while we are partisan, just because a person has got an R by their name or a D by their name does not make us monolithic. And certainly, I think that the legislative process should proceed, and the legislature should draw a map. And the courts have a role, but I don't think it is a fait accompli that it has to get to the courts. I do think that we still, and maybe because I'm a little older than you, at least I appear to be, you look young, I do remember a time when we could work together and come up with maps, and come up with lots of things that were done through what has become a dirty word for young activists on both sides, compromise.
Well, if you don't mind, I will say I'm a firm supporter of compromise. I'm a firm supporter of many things that people on the left do, and respect your angle and your commentary and your responses. I think the main problem is that, especially on the left, you see people who resort to the courts when they don't have power. And when you have the option to have a court just redraw the maps to your side's liking, there's really no incentive to come to the table and find a solution. And that's really a problem, and it takes away power from the voters. So thank you, Senator.
Thank you all. Throughout our history, we have seen donkey mandering to aid Democratic members. Oh, I was proceeding into my conclusion. Senator Dush.
Yeah, I'd just like to, a couple of the points that you brought up are critical. In the Supreme Court's ruling in 2017 and 2018, I had no problem with them striking down that map. That map was an abomination. But what I did have a problem with is the fact that the Supreme Court put an unrealistic deadline on the legislature. If they'd have just allowed us to go back to the timelines that are set up under the statute for establishing a map, I think we could have done it. In fact, I was in the map room when I was in the House when they came down with their decision to turn it over to a California professor to draw the map for Pennsylvania. There was zero transparency in that process. And delegating that decision to somebody outside of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I think, was an abomination in itself. That's why I had the impeachment resolutions against all 4 of those justices. They don't have the authority to write law, and the congressional maps are pieces of legislation. We were moving with alacrity. We were there. We were trying to get the maps done in time to actually have them done for the primary. But because the previous map was unconstitutional, we had to do something. We need to keep this out of the hands of the courts, and I really appreciate the minority chairman's willingness to keep working on this process and make this transparent and holding these hearings alongside of us, because I want us to put this in a position where the governor really is loath to veto it and send it to the court, because it does not belong in the court. It does belong with the legislature. And I truly appreciate Senator Street's efforts to help make this happen in the way that we're working on it. With that, I just wanted to thank you for the points that you brought out. And that's basically all I had to say.
Senator Street.
I just wanted to say something I don't think I've had an opportunity to say at this microphone before, but I agree with Senator Dush that we should and can get this done.
Well, that should give us all hope. Mr. Eisenberg, to you, to all of those who have testified at this, our 3rd public hearing on congressional districting, thank you.